This is the story of a species that ruled Europe for longer than our own kind has existed. And then, in the space of just a few thousand years, vanished so completely that we've spent 160 years arguing about why. The Neanderthals were not failures. They weren't the dim-witted brutes of old museum dioramas. They survived ice ages, hunted the largest and most dangerous animals on the continent, cared for their sick, buried their dead, and made tools and ornaments for longer than our own kind has walked the earth. And then they were gone. Here's the unsettling part. After more than a century of digging, sequencing, and arguing, no scientist can point to a single thing that killed them. There is no smoking gun. And that absence might be the biggest clue of all. Let's start with who they actually were. Neanderthals spread across Europe and Western Asia beginning around 400,000 years ago. They branched off from our shared family tree somewhere near 600,000 years ago, which meant that by the time the two lineages met again, they'd been evolving apart for a very long time. They were built for the cold, stocky, and powerful, with barrel chests and wide noses that warmed frigid air before it reached their lungs. By any reasonable measure, they were a wildly successful species, perfectly tuned to one of the harshest environments on the planet. For hundreds of thousands of years, Europe was theirs. Then, around 45,000 years ago, something changed. Our own species, Homo sapiens, began pushing out of Africa and into Europe. And within roughly 5,000 years of that arrival, not a single Neanderthal remained anywhere on Earth. 5,000 years sounds like a long time, but for a species that had endured for hundreds of thousands, it's the blink of an eye. One group thrived for an eternity, the other showed up, and shortly after, the first group was simply gone. So the obvious story writes itself. We showed up, we won, they lost. For a long time, that was the popular version, and we pictured spear-throwing conflict, our clever ancestors out competing and maybe even slaughtering their heavy-browed cousins. It's a tidy narrative. It's also almost certainly wrong, or at least so incomplete that it misses the real tragedy of what happened. Because when scientists went looking for evidence of a war, of a massacre, of one clean cause of death, they kept coming back empty-handed. Here's where the mystery deepens, and the first real clue turns up in an unlikely place: your own DNA. If you have ancestry from anywhere outside of Africa, you're carrying a piece of a Neanderthal inside you right now. On average, about 2% of the genome of non-African people is Neanderthal in origin. That's not a metaphor. Tens of thousands of years ago, Neanderthals and modern humans met, and at least sometimes they had children together, and those children had children all the way down the long chain of generations to you. So the very first thing that breaks the simple extinction story is this: they didn't vanish without a trace. They left their trace inside us. And that 2% may be the faded remainder of something much larger. Population genetics models suggest Neanderthals may once have contributed something closer to 10% of the human gene pool, a share that got whittled down over the millennia by natural selection. Researchers at Princeton, led by geneticist Joshua Akey, found that the Neanderthal population at the time of contact was probably about 20% smaller than earlier estimates suggested. A smaller population meeting a larger one produces a very particular kind of ending. As Akey described it, human populations were larger, and like waves crashing on a beach, they eventually eroded the Neanderthals. Their gene pool, in his words, was likely absorbed into ours. There's even evidence running the other direction: modern human DNA making up somewhere between 2.5% and nearly 4% of the Neanderthal genome. The fingerprint of interbreeding stretching back much further than anyone once believed. So one answer to where the Neanderthals went is almost poetic. They didn't all die. Some of them, genetically speaking, became us. But absorption can't be the whole story, because it doesn't explain the deeper question. Why were their numbers so small to begin with? Why were they vulnerable enough to be swallowed up at all? To answer that, we have to look at how Neanderthals actually lived. And this is where the picture turns from a tale of conquest into something quieter and, honestly, sadder. Neanderthals lived in small groups, very small. When researchers at the Globe Institute in Copenhagen sequenced the genome of a Neanderthal man found in a cave in southern France, they discovered something striking. He was inbred. His people had been living in tiny, isolated bands for many generations, with very little new genetic diversity flowing in from outside. And low diversity is dangerous over the long run, because it leaves a population fragile, slower to adapt, more exposed to the accumulating costs of a shrinking gene pool. A separate study of Neanderthal remains from across Belgium, France, Germany, and Serbia pointed the same direction, a kind of genetic impoverishment among the last Neanderthals, their diversity drastically reduced compared to what came before. But I have to be honest with you here, because the science refuses to stay simple. In a study published in the journal Nature, researchers sequencing the DNA of Neanderthals from northwestern Europe found the opposite. Those individuals were relatively genetically diverse, part of a bigger, interconnected regional population, with none of the classic warning signs of inbreeding. So inbreeding wasn't a death sentence stamped on the whole species. It was real in some places and absent in others. And that tells us something important. There was no single uniform cause ticking down like a clock toward the same ending everywhere. The story changed from valley to valley, region to region. Which brings us to what may be the deepest clue of all. It isn't really about genes, it's about connection. Think about what a small, isolated group is missing. Not just genetic diversity, but information, trade, backup. When your entire social world is a few dozen people and the nearest other band is far away and rarely seen, then every hard winter, every failed hunt, every local disaster lands with full force and nothing to soften it. Now compare that to how Homo sapiens lived. A recent study led by anthropologist Ariane Burke at the University of Montreal used techniques borrowed from digital ecology to model exactly this. And the conclusion was pointed. The key difference between the two species may not have been climate, and may not have been direct competition. It may have been social connectivity. Modern humans built stronger, more flexible networks that reached across long distances. Neanderthals had connections too, but theirs were more fragile, more regionally confined. And that made all the difference once conditions started to swing. We can see this advantage written into the archaeological record. Early Homo sapiens ran long-distance trade networks, moving materials and, just as importantly, information across vast stretches of territory. When their preferred foods failed in one place, those networks acted as a buffer, a lifeline reaching toward somewhere the hunting was still good. Neanderthals, as far as the evidence shows, didn't have this. They were, in a real sense, alone in a way we never were. Now layer the climate on top. This was the Ice Age, and it wasn't a stable, steady cold. It lurched. Temperatures could swing dramatically over relatively short spans, and Neanderthals were highly specialized hunters, tuned over hundreds of thousands of years to bring down large Ice Age animals. Specialization is a superpower when your environment is predictable. It becomes a trap when it isn't. When the climate whiplashed and some of those big animals declined or moved on, a species locked into hunting them was suddenly staring at starvation. A well-connected population can adapt, spread out, trade for what it lacks, and share word of new food sources. An isolated one just starves in place. And here's the pattern. Every one of these threads, the small populations, the pockets of inbreeding, the dietary specialization, the violent swings of climate, the slow absorption into a larger gene pool, none of them on its own is enough to erase a species that survived for 400,000 years. Scientists spent well over a century hunting for the one cause, the clean answer. And the reason they never found it is that it was never one thing. It was all of it at once. Compounding. The most recent research points exactly this way. The disappearance likely came from a combination of climate instability, population pressure, and social structure, and the precise blend differed depending on where you were standing. In one region, it might have been isolation and inbreeding. In another, a collapsing food supply. In another, quiet absorption into the rising tide of newcomers. There was no single battlefield. There were 1,000 small rooms, and in each of them, a slightly different ending. And through nearly all of those endings runs the same thread. Connection, or the lack of it. Homo sapiens survived not because we were smarter, not because we were stronger, and not because we were more ruthless. In raw individual terms, Neanderthals may well have matched us. We survived because we were connected. When disaster struck one group, another group, somewhere over the horizon, could reach back. We were a network. They were islands. And islands, when the sea rises, go under one at a time. Some researchers frame the ending in an even gentler way. Since humans outnumbered Neanderthals by something like 10 to 1 during the years they overlapped, it's possible the Neanderthals didn't truly die off at all, but simply melted into us. Not extinction by warfare or competition, but something closer to a merger. One writer put it in a line that stays with you. Perhaps the Neanderthals disappeared not because of conflict, but because of love. I don't think it was quite that gentle. Small populations, hunger, isolation, the long, grinding disadvantage of being alone in a world that increasingly belonged to a more connected species. That's not a soft ending. But it wasn't a war either. It was something more like a slow fade, a species that never got the chance to weather its bad years because it lacked the web of relationships that lets a population absorb a shock and recover. National Geographic noted something haunting about this extinction. It may be the only one in the history of life on Earth with no purely natural cause, one bound up entirely with the arrival and success of another kind of human. Some researchers even fold the Neanderthals into the earliest chapter of the sixth extinction, the wave of losses tied to us, not through malice, just through presence, through being larger, more connected, better able to spread and hold ground. So when you ask why the Neanderthals really disappeared, the honest answer isn't a single dramatic event. It's that a resilient, capable, deeply human species ran out of the one thing that would have let it survive everything else, and that thing was each other. They didn't lose because they were weak. They lost because they were alone. And a piece of them, the 2% that still rides quietly in so many of us, never really left at all. If mysteries like this one are what you're here for, subscribe and stick around, because there are plenty more waiting. Thanks for watching.